So there's this t-shirt I wear. It's called Ben Reality. It's a Mindvalley t-shirt, and it's become one of the most popular t-shirts within Mindvalley. Like all over Instagram, you see people wearing this t-shirt, hashtagging it Ben Reality. But I want to tell you where this phrase came from, because this phrase means something a lot to me. So it started around 2008-ish. 2008-ish. Me and my friends at that time, we started experimenting with ways of applying different tools of consciousness to building a business, right? And we noticed that as we started playing with some of these tools, it would almost seem as if we would accelerate our progress in this business. And it almost felt as if we were lucky that we were going downhill rather than uphill. And so we coined this term, Ben Reality, and we thought it was just our silly little nonsense. We had, of course, watched movies like The Secret and that law of attraction stuff, which we always felt was kindergarten and way too simplistic and not necessarily complete, right? But playing around with different tools that allowed you to access altered states, that allowed you to merge with different elements of consciousness, we found that as entrepreneurs we could accelerate that flow. But we thought it was just us, and we thought this Ben Reality phrase just belonged to us until October 2011, when a man by the name of Walter Isaacson released a book called Steve Jobs. And in that book, 3 times he uses the phrase Ben Reality. So check this out, right? Because this is fascinating. Now, the first time he mentioned it in the book had to do in a conversation between Steve and another entrepreneur by the name of Bushnell. Bushnell was the founder of Atari. If you grew up in the 80s like me, you remember Atari games. And Bushnell said this of Jobs: "We used to discuss free will versus determinism. I tended to believe that things were much more determined, that we were programmed. If we had perfect information, we could predict people's actions." Steve felt the opposite. That outlook accorded with his faith in the power of the will to bend reality. Okay, now let's go further. Now, isn't that really cool? Steve Jobs felt differently. He felt in the power of the will to bend reality. Now, Isaacson goes deeper and he explains it like this. At the root of his reality distortion was Jobs' belief that the rules didn't apply to him. He had some evidence for this. In his childhood, he had often been able to bend reality to his desires. Rebelliousness and willfulness were ingrained in his character. He had the sense that he was special, a chosen one, an enlightened one. He thinks there are few people who are special, people like Einstein and Gandhi and the gurus he met in India, and he's one of them. So I found this fascinating. You have this guy called Steve Jobs who believes that he can bend reality. He's a guy who grew up in California but traveled to India to meditate, to meet with gurus. In fact, when Mark Zuckerberg asked Steve Jobs for advice on building up Facebook, one of the first things Steve told Mark is to go to India and seek a particular ashram or meditation school and spend some time there. Now, what was going on? Was Steve really a modern day mystic? Now, as you read more about Steve Jobs, you start noticing that he had this incredible ability to make bold declarations and then make it happen. So there was a discussion recently on Quora. Quora is a Q&A board of the internet where you can ask any question and people come to answer. And someone asked this: what are the best stories about people randomly meeting Steve Jobs? So an engineer by the name of Thomas Higbee shares the story. So in 1994, Higbee worked at Next. Next was a company that Jobs was running when he was kicked out of Apple and before he went back to Apple, right? So Higbee says he was in the break room with 2 colleagues. They were making a bagel and Steve walks in to make his bagel. And then Steve, out of the blue, turns to them and goes, "Who is the most powerful person in the world?" And Higbee says Mandela, because Higbee had actually worked in South Africa as an international observer during the elections. And Steve replies, according to Higbee, "No, you are all wrong. The most powerful person in the world is the storyteller." The storyteller, says Steve, sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation that is to come, and Disney has a monopoly on the storyteller business. You know what, says Steve, I am tired of this bullshit. I am going to be the next storyteller. Now, this was in 1994, and again, Steve seemed to bend reality. What happened next is that in a short span of just a few years, Steve unleashes Toy Story through his company Pixar. It becomes one of the most celebrated movies of its time. Pixar becomes one of the most remarkable companies of its time. Disney acquires Pixar and Steve Jobs becomes the #1 shareholder at Disney. Steve Jobs owns more of Disney than anybody else. And while he pulled that off, He uses storytelling to create Apple, which becomes the biggest company in the world today, $1 trillion behemoth that changes everything. Now, what kind of man walks into a lunchroom to pick up a bagel and declares that he is going to be the next great storyteller, and then in the span of 12 to 13 years actually shifts the tide of the world to make that happen? And that's why I believe that there is such a thing as people who have the ability to create mass influence in the world. And I honestly don't know what's going on. I don't know why it works, but I know that if you look at the ancient Indian sages, the gurus at the ashrams that Steve went to study at, they talk about the world as an illusion. They talk about the world as Maya, and they say that with the right training, you can shift this Maya. You can, in short, bend reality. So if you find these ideas fascinating, I certainly do, and I've been exploring these ideas for almost a decade now. I've used many of these ideas to create the life that I want, to create Mindvalley and other companies I've created. I'm certainly like at a tiny slice of that compared to masters like Steve Jobs, and yes, I call him a master. But what I like to do is to create a structured approach so that not just I can do it, but thousands of people can play with these ideas.